Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And today we're going to look at fishing a floating nymph. Now, I have done this before. I've taken a relatively light wire nymph, stuck some floatant on it, and hope for the best. This is the first time I've really sat around and analyzed what's going on with a floating nymph. So you can see in this shot I am fishing my local creek. I'm using the NRX plus 8.5 foot 4 weight and just a regular floating trout line, nothing special there. And in this shot, you'll see that I start by retrieving line back to me, and all I'm doing is staying in contact with the fly. I'm not stripping the fly. I'm not trying to move it. I'm just picking up slack. So here we go, and I keep getting little hits from little fish. And I think we'll just stop it there. I got some very brief hookups, which is fine. I don't want to be touching the little guys, so if they get off, I'm very happy. I did have two refusals from larger flies, and these were splashy refusals. A larger fish, I should say. These were splashy refusals. They came up to the surface, broke the surface, rolled, and went back down again. And there was no hatch going on. Nothing was happening at all. So this is the wrong kind of fly to fish in these conditions. You want, mayflies emerging to actually fish as effectively. So I used the fly that I had tied up in the previous video, and I did run into some issues, and it accounted for these refusals. And when I get to the end of this video, we'll illustrate what was going on. But the reality is I didn't hook up a good fish all day. Okay, well, all day, for the hour I was out there. It was just little guys, and they were getting off, which was suited me just fine. But all through here, I was whacking little fish, and I moved up the creek, and basically the same thing. I'd get the odd hit from a little guy, and I just missed a half decent one. That was a refusal. He never touched the fly. So I was in here, tried a few spots, and fished my way up the creek. And I had a little further up here, I had a refusal where the fish rolled under the fly but never came up and broke the surface. And what I was finding, which was quite interesting, I'll just stop it right there, we'll get to it. If I made no false casts, so in other words, I just did a roll cast pickup and tossed it out with a spay cast or a roll cast, I would see that the fly, after one or two casts of doing that, the fly would sink and be completely under the water. If I made one false cast, most of the time it would sit in the surface film exactly the way we wanted it to do so, like we have in the test tank footage of it sitting just hanging down with just the foam poking through. But what was happening a lot of the time, if I made too many false casts, I dried the fly out too much and it wouldn't penetrate the surface film at all. Now what we're going to see here in this next little bit is actually a fly that I've had lurking about in a box, in a pocket, for over 20 years. I was fishing Penn's Creek. I found a fleece patch on the side of the creek. It had some flies in it. This is one of them, and it turned out to have some foam on it. So I thought, well, I'll try my fly. It's not catching anything, so let me go to a different color, a brighter color, and see what happens. And we see that this fly does not really do what we need it to do. It's not penetrating the surface film, despite being tied on a fairly heavy hook. So I'll stop it right there. That's a standard gauge hook. That's not a light wire hook. So despite that relatively heavy hook, the floatant was enough to keep that thing above the surface film. Not only that, you can see that it's canted on its side. It's not hanging straight. And that was accounting for the refusals. This is the fly that the fish rolled under. I just saw it come up and go back down again without ever breaking the surface. It came up to check it out, and because of that posture, it didn't like it. So the bottom line here is you don't want to false cast too often because you dry your fly out and then it won't penetrate. In fact, what I was doing, it was actually sort of slapping the fly in a little bit, just popping it down so it would plop into the water and break the surface tension. Because if you laid it out, it wouldn't break the surface tension. This one, if I plopped it into the water, it would bob back to the surface. So there's a lesson here about how much material we put on the fly, because the more material you have, the greater the opportunity for the floatant to to embed itself in the material, and it sinks even less. You might want to try just putting some foam just at the top of the foam. Sorry, put some fly floatant on the foam or just on the top of the thorax. Don't put anything on the abdomen so it wouldn't get underneath the surface. So this was a problem. So the bottom line is don't heavily dress the fly. This one is heavily dressed. Don't use too much floatant, and don't false cast too much. And then you get a decent float out of it. You have to be aware, you have to always look at your fly as it's approaching you before you pick it up to see if it's just that little bit of foam sticking out of the water, or is it on its side sitting in the surface film. So you're always having to watch that. And it accounts for the reason why probably in years past I didn't do too well with this method, probably because the fly was not behaving naturally and not hanging in the surface film rather than sitting on top of the surface film. So with a good floatant, you can keep these flies floating despite a heavier hook. So I used a light wire hook in mine. This is a heavy hook. So when you're setting out to use floating nymph techniques, it takes more awareness of how the fly is behaving when we're out fishing. So don't spend too much time false casting because you're just screwing things up. And as I say, watch. And as I say, I saw that happening. I pulled out my little Olympus TG5 and tried to get a close-up view of it because the macro on that camera is pretty good. And that's the best I could do. But you get an idea of how it was sitting in the surface film. So bottom line is this method was picking up fish, attracting fish, even though there was no hatch going on. But if the fly wasn't floating well, you didn't get hookups. And you didn't, the fish refused. So I think it's an effective method, and other people have done it before. It's nothing new. It's been around for a long time. But I don't think, if my experience is any judge, probably a lot of people don't get good results from it, and so they go away from it. And really it's just a matter of how the fly is floating. So give that some thought and give it a try. Cheers.